It's very easy to say, look, Russia is behind all of this. This is a very, very destabilizing country. But again, I think we need to be a little bit careful in how we understand how that destabilization actually manifests itself.
In the case of Ukraine, Bosnia, whoever, if they can create enough destabilization, even an internal violence conflict, prevents the countries from becoming part of NATO.
People, especially if they come from smaller countries that feel vulnerable against a larger neighbor, will often cling to a great power that in their minds they feel will stand up for them.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everybody. It is Piotr, and this is The Global Gambit. It's part two in in three parts, I think is what I meant to say, conversation with Professor James Lindsay. James is an expert in many things. He takes a lot of time to research into his topics, as he very eloquently told us in the first part. But his main area and where he's based at the moment is Cyprus and southeastern area, Europe, or otherwise the Western Balkans. So, James, we're going to have a bit of jump around the region a little bit. But I think one of the main questions I have for you, and we'll be touching upon Ukraine, everyone who's watching, so stay around till then at the end of the episode. But we just had an important election in Serbia. Vucic has somehow managed to stay in power. But I get the sense that this isn't a very happy result for many Serbians. Could you take us through a little bit what the sentiment is in Serbia? And is there a desire to want to move closer to the West or stay closer to Russia? Because one academic who I've had on the show before said that Serbia is essentially hedging. So what is the position? And tag-on question, do you agree with Serbia as hedging?
A tough one to start with. Look, I mean, so there's several different areas there. I mean, I think the first is talking about the elections. And there has obviously been a lot of disquiet about the way that the elections have played out. We've seen that the European Parliament has been very critical of this and wants to see, commission a report into it. And I think what we're seeing here are a combination of factors. So on the one hand, there's a sense that there isn't enough free and open debate in Serbia these days. That the media is quite tightly controlled, and that this is obviously a deep source of concern. But I also think that, we've got to be a little bit careful in how we look at the sentiments in Serbia, because, and we find this in many countries, that there tends to be a very small group who act, if you like, as the interlocutors between the country and the outside world, especially when you're talking about sort of European countries and things like that. And it will often be a very small group that will be based in Belgrade or any capital that tends to be far more sort of liberal in outlook than maybe necessarily the wider population. And this is quite clearly a problem that we're seeing in a lot of countries. I think it's very tempting to get caught in that Belgrade bubble of, just saying Vucic is this awful character who's absolutely terrible and we've got to get rid of him at all costs and he must be manipulating the elections. But when you go outside of Belgrade, there will often be people who will say, but he's done things. He's achieved results. He's brought in investment to the country. We've seen an improvement in our standard of living. Right. And so there's this sort of disconnect. And a lot of people still remember the very pro-Western government that was in power under Boris Tadic, that was a darling of the West in many ways, but did very little internally. And I think that had a big effect. And so, Vucic, who most people would say is an unusual character. I think we've also got to be a little bit careful. I mean, I think that we sometimes get a little bit simplistic in how we lump people together into a certain category. And sort of, so there's lots of people who are saying, oh, Vucic is mates with Orban. He must be like Orban. And he isn't. I absolutely don't believe that. I mean, I've met Vucic a few times and sort of engaging not just with him, but other people around him and things like that. You sort of get the sense that this is somebody who genuinely wants to be liked and adored. He feels he's doing things for Serbia and he doesn't take well to criticism. And I think that this is the danger, that what we've seen is that this is somebody who's, maybe got too thin a skin and sort of just wants to be loved because he's bringing investment. Why don't they like me? People also say, oh, but, he controls the media. You get a client media that evolves, that doesn't necessarily take orders from the government, but actually supports the government for whatever reason. And so wants to puff it up, and, you start getting contracts and things like that. It becomes a very murky. And as I say, I think sometimes in Western Europe, we feel a little bit superior, that this can't possibly go on in our countries, but of course it does.
It does.
And there's all sorts of corruption that we now see taking place in the UK in recent years under the Conservative government. So I think sometimes I'm a little bit cautious about, but returning again to the point about Serbia. So all this is simply to say that I think, someone like Orban is quite clearly very unpleasant and a troll, to put it simply. He is trolling Europe, and he takes great pleasure in it. I don't get the sense that Vučić is like that.
No, I agree.
I think we need to be a little bit careful about the dynamics of what's going on there. And yes, let's investigate these elections. Let's do it rigorously and independently and fairly. But also let's bear in mind that this is somebody who genuinely, outside of that Belgrade bubble, is probably more popular. And we've also got to consider that the opposition in Serbia is appallingly weak.
That's the case, I think, right?
For its own reasons as well. So people would say to me, but it must be that the opposition isn't allowed to flourish. I was in an online event a few weeks ago at the University of Belgrade, and you had academics who were quite happy to be critical of the government, and nothing was going to happen. I've been in situations where I've spoken to Hungarian academics, and they say, we cannot be quoted on what we're saying. We will lose our jobs. You don't have that in Serbia. So it's a very, very different dynamic. And I think we need to be a little bit careful about all of this.
No, absolutely. I think that's quite interesting to hear that take, because it's not one that is as mentioned or raised. To your point about the media, think about it in America even, right? Their only real right-wing representation is Fox News. Just to put it in the inverted example, right? Everything else is largely centre left or left. And in Britain, you're right, apart from the Guardian and I think the Independent or something, it's largely all right-wing and at least in written media. So there is that element. But I just wanted to bring in also the Bosnian element to this, because I think one of the biggest concerns a lot of people have is Republic of Srpska. For people, historical context is Republic of Srpska is one of the territories within Bosnia that wants to sort of, detach and become more aligned or absorbed even with Serbia, sort of greater Serbia if you want. But the EU are very wary of this as well. And this is why I think we're seeing a fast track of Bosnia as a candidate country in the EU as a way to sort of try to protect Bosnia from a potential, I don't want to say civil war, but a large-scale destabilisation with influences from Russia. Is that something you're feeling, James? What is happening between Bosnia, Serbia, and also the EU? How do you see that?
Look, Bosnia is quite clearly a worry. You speak to any policymaker, and they'll tell you that the biggest concern they really have in the Balkans is Bosnia, for all sorts of reasons. It's a country that's, it's stagnating. There are very serious worries about rise of, tensions between the country's different communities. This is definitely something to worry about. And, I've never hidden the fact that, someone like Milorad Dodik, who's the leader of Republika Srpska, is very much a troublemaker. He is much more, I would say, in the model of Orban than Vučić is. If I'm to be, give some sort of perspective in that regard. He gets, he's, for anyone who's familiar with Cyprus, I also think that Dodik is much more, and probably Orban the same, is like the legendary Turkish Cypriot leader Rauf Denktash, who's just, again, loved to troll people. It would almost be like, I'm going to get out to bed this morning and I'm going to say something which is going to get everyone upset, and he comes out and says it. He goes to bed at night, sleeps soundly, knowing that he's irritated and he's upset people and that they're all talking and, shouting into, you must do something about it. I think Dodik's exactly the same. I think he's a troublemaker. The trouble with a troublemaker in that sort of situation is a very febrile atmosphere. And so when he starts talking about secession, I don't think it's something that's going to come off. I mean, for all sorts of complex reasons and not so complex reasons that, Serbia, it would absolutely be a disaster for Serbia to try and support this. And all that would happen is if Dodik tried to declare independence tomorrow, any exit routes from Republika Srpska would be blocked. Plane flights into Banja Luka for example, would be stopped and everything like that. Serbia would come under enormous pressure, and Serbia would just know that, look, any hopes of EU membership would go out of the window. Russia can't support Republika Srpska if it tries to secede. Look how many NATO countries you have to overfly to get there. So, I think that, it's not something that we should be as worried as we are about. But the trouble is that for many ordinary Bosniaks, so, the people that were once called Bosnian Muslims, they get terribly exercised about this. They hear this sort of rhetoric and they think he's going to try and break away. And then you start to get into this vicious cycle of them starting to think, right, okay, if he's going to try and break away and, maybe try and use armed force to do it, then we have to be prepared for it. And that's when things become really dangerous. So I often say that, the internationals have got to be really careful not to try and give credence to what someone like Dodik is saying, but constantly try and reassure certainly the Bosniaks that, look, this isn't going to happen. We will do everything in our power to stop it. Don't rise to the bait. And I think, the best thing, we do the best service in all these situations, in all these conflicts, to try and take a level-headed view and say, look, you know what, when there's reason to worry, okay, let's be clear why there's reason to worry. But when there isn't, then we should also be mindful of our duty to try and sort of calm things down and explain.
No, indeed it does. And you touch upon Kosovo, so I'd like to visit that briefly. And then I do want to actually explore a little bit Turkey and Cyprus. So, and obviously all of this in the context of Russia's, omnipresence. So what about Kosovo then? Because we've seen tensions in the past, year and a half over number plates on and off. I don't think Pristina, the capital of the government, has been necessarily very helpful at times. And I believe NATO did produce a pretty stern, uncharacteristically in this context at least, statement criticizing Pristina, not just Belgrade, over the tensions and flare-ups. What's your sense about those two at the moment and how we could see it playing out?
Kosovo is clearly a worry. And I've always found myself sort of torn when it comes to discussing Kosovo. So, look, I never hid the fact that I was deeply, deeply concerned about the way that Kosovo declared independence. So I work on secession, I work on state recognition. Yeah. I really felt that this was very troubling. But I'm torn by the fact that in every logical sense, an independent Kosovo makes sense. The idea that all the other republics of Yugoslavia had gone their own way and Kosovo wasn't a republic. And that's frankly, it's almost on a technicality. It's an important technicality in international law because it's a sub-state unit. And we have this principle that sub-state units can't unilaterally secede. So at this point, all the Kosovo Albanians get upset with me. It wasn't a unilateral declaration of independence. It was a coordinated. There's no such thing as a coordinated declaration. It was just a nice term that was made up to put it bigly. It was a unilateral declaration of independence. Unilateral just simply means one side did it and the other side didn't agree. That's all it means, and where you've got consent, countries can become independent. We've got all sorts of countries around the world that have become, and that was the problem, and there's a whole story, I've written about it at length, that we created this problem with Kosovo that I think could have been avoided if it had been much better handled by all the actors, by Serbia, by the Kosovo Albanians, by the internationals. Everyone messed up, and it's a whole story. We could do episode after episode on the messes that were made. But we were left with this problem that in every logical sense, Kosovo is and should be independent, but it's deadlocked. We have had moments where it looked like Belgrade and Pristina could reach an agreement. And, there's all sorts of ideas for, essentially it boils down to two ideas as to how you solve this. Do you do a land territorial adjustment, which lots of people get really upset about, and I've never really quite understood why. It's actually a very logical answer. Or do you set up these sort of autonomy arrangements? And it looked like we were making progress on that. And you've currently got a government in Pristina which is steadfastly opposed to it, and is actually taking, I think, what are very destabilizing moves. And this is what we've seen at the moment, that there's been a lot of unhappiness amongst sort of Kosovo's Western supporters saying, look, you know, to Albin Kurti, who's the current prime minister of Kosovo, that you really aren't helping matters, that you're trying to enforce, Kosovo-Albanian, essentially, control over the Serbian areas. And this is not helping matters in the slightest. You're becoming a source of tension in a region that we worry about tension growing. And frankly, you're becoming a source of problems at a time when we don't need those problems. You know, we've got other issues that we need to be focusing on, and this is unnecessary. You know, time to get that to the table, time to meet those commitments to set up this association of Serbian municipalities, which is this autonomy arrangement. But again, actually, just to sort of comment on this is also one of those interesting elements where you get Balkan crossovers. So one of the big problems that we've seen with Kosovo is that they've been talking about this system of autonomy for the Serbs, which is actually a very light form of autonomy. But you've had a lot of people coming from the Bosnia conflict who are saying, oh, no, you mustn't do this. It's going to be another Republic of Serbs. Don't you dare do this. This is going to... And they've helped to make a mess of all of this. So it's another one of those cases where, you know, thank you very much. You know, in order to get some clicks and some likes, you know, you're messing around with another conflict that, frankly, please don't do that. You're just making matters worse. So it's been a deteriorating situation to a point that, you know, I think there are now real worries in various governments. And in NATO and the European Union about the direction that Kosovo's take. There are solutions in both Bosnia and Kosovo. Kosovo's the easier of the two, though, I have to say, if you had to get me to decide which is the one I'd want to focus on first.
Well, I was about to ask you just that, but there we go. So shifting on down to, well, there's another question about that just after this one, though, but I want your quick take on the Turkish Cypriot relations and Greece. Obviously, there's a lot of tensions over... well, maritime tension, which is more, let's be honest, related to energy. But, you know, Cyprus is there's still this consideration of enosis, which is the Greek term for unification with Cyprus. And there have been talks between the two, i.e. Turkey and Greece and Cyprus, obviously, in Geneva over the past couple of years. What's your take on that, given Turkey's leadership shit and just generally the whole mess coming from Cyprus? What's your take on that?
Cyprus is incredibly frustrating. I mean, you know, this is a conflict that is marking 3 substantial anniversaries this year. So 1964 was the origins of the United Nations peacekeeping force in Cyprus, set up under Resolution 186 of the 4th of March 1964. Now, why I immediately rolled that off, I wrote my PhD on how the UN force got here. This was something that took place, you know, about 8 years before I'm born. I'm now in my 50s. This is something that has been here a very long time, 60th anniversary this year. And there are obviously questions about how long a peacekeeping force is meant to remain in place. What is its objective? It's also the 50th anniversary of 1974, which is when Turkey invaded and the island was divided. So, you know, another important milestone. And it's the 20th anniversary of the Annan Plan for Reunification. So this was a UN plan that was put forward. It's also the 20th anniversary of Cyprus joining the European Union. So this referendum on unification took place. And then exactly a week later, Cyprus joined the European Union, still divided. And, you know, there was a lot of talk at the time, well, you know, we'll have another opportunity soon. There was one more major opportunity, which was UN-led talks in 2017 that took place in Switzerland. Sadly, they didn't produce a result. And, you know, here we are, coming up for 7 years since that. And I took part as, you know, in those talks as part of the UK delegation. So for all sorts of historical reasons. So Cyprus was once a British colony. When it became, and by a quirk of its constitution, it also became, along with Greece and Turkey, a guarantor of Cypriot independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and, all the arguments that none of those three countries have fully met their commitments under it. But what it means is that in any peace talks, Greece and Turkey, along with Britain, are represented in that. And we had these talks that took place in 2017 in Crans-Montana in Switzerland. Sadly, we didn't get an agreement. And so it's essentially, since then, it's been, how can we get these talks restarted again? And there is some hope. So the UN Secretary General has just appointed a new personal envoy.
There's some reservations there. There's some hesitations, I feel, that you've got coming through on the on this appointment.
No, not at all. Look, I was very fortunate to have met her, Maria Holguin Cuellar, who used to be Foreign Minister of Colombia. If it's hesitation, it's simply because I've worked on Cyprus now for 35 years. I've written, I think, about 7 or 8 books on Cyprus and its problem and everything like that. I've seen lots of people come and go, and also, like many others, have become increasingly concerned that we just can't keep repeating this. But what do we do if we can't solve it? And it's really a huge problem. And so I'm actually more confident than I've been for a long time that maybe we can do something, but there are huge problems nevertheless, that we've got to overcome when we're talking about Cyprus. And the first step, of course, is that now we have the Turkish Cypriots and Turkey increasingly talking about a two-state solution, which stands contrary to all the UN Security Council resolutions. I'm certainly somebody who believes that Greek and Turkish Cypriots can live together. I think there's a particular model of a solution which makes more sense, and maybe a more decentralized form of federation. It's still a very, very difficult conflict to resolve. By the way, it's not difficult in terms of what we know the solution is. It could be solved within a month. We know what the parameters of the settlement are going to look like. It's just getting that political will. And that's absolutely crucial.
I think we've got a good few events this year, as you say, that are related to the historical relevancy of this. And I look forward to maybe having you back, in November. I know it's a while away, but, something to talk about the 1974 events as well as 1964. But I guess a quick question for you, if you had to summarize simply, how much do you think that the events in the Balkans some of the issues are stemming from the influence of Russia and the destabilisation tactics? They seem like the omnipresence across a lot of not necessarily Cyprus, but the Western Balkans more broadly. Is that something you see?
Yes, look, as is the pattern with, perhaps what I'm saying, I think we need to be cautious and we need to be careful. It's very easy to say, look, Russia is behind all of this. And, I try and take a balanced view in most of the subjects that I cover on my channel. But when it comes to Russia, I think, this is a very, very destabilizing country. We're clearly seeing that in Ukraine. That much is absolutely, and we know that it's got this pattern of destabilization in other places, including the Balkans. But again, I think we need to be a little bit careful in how we understand how that destabilization actually manifests itself. So I think, when we talk about Serbia, for example, we talk, and, this comes back to the first question you asked, which was, how influential is Russia? I think I've tended to say that I think we need to be very, very careful in how we look at what Moscow does and how Serbia reacts to it. And I will often give sort of stories of examples that I've come across, which show that, on the surface, many Serbs will be virulently pro-Russian, but underneath it, they know that Russia has actually played quite a malign role in their history and that it's not as trustworthy. But, what you often find in these situations is that people, especially if they come from smaller countries that feel vulnerable against a larger neighbor, will often cling to a great power that in their minds they feel will stand up for them. Whether that's realistic or not. We saw that a lot actually here in Cyprus. And one of the interesting things is that the level of support for Russia has substantially declined, I think, in Cyprus and in Greece, for example. Greece and also Cyprus, even though it's fully independent of Greece, there's still a very close relationship. And I think that, we see a lot of Greeks now who actually understand the game that Russia is playing. For example, the North Macedonia name issue, for example, Greece kicked out a couple of Russian diplomats at the time of the deal who were trying to foment unrest against the deal. Because ultimately, Putin relies, Russia doesn't have a lot of hard power influence that people like to think of, but it's been quite successful in leveraging its other advantages. And of course, being a member of the Security Council has over the years been tremendously powerful. So we've seen it in the way that, it's played that with the Greek Cypriots. If there's something you don't like, come talk to us, we'll block it. It's done that a lot with Serbia. So the fact that Kosovo isn't a member of the United Nations is largely down to Russia. China also has its reservations. So Russia's been extremely good at playing that. But I think also there's been a sense that Russia isn't necessarily as trustworthy as people like to think it is, because it gives them a sense of security, that it's not just them against the West. Now, in the case of Cyprus, it's been very interesting because Cyprus has shifted its foreign policy much more in a Western direction over the past decade. It's been quite remarkable. Serbia, on the other hand, you talked earlier about hedging and has it done that? I think there is certainly a degree of that. But, in speaking with a lot of Serbian officials, they've understood that ultimately they need Russia's Security Council veto over Kosovo, but they've also known that economic success comes from the European Union. And so I've long argued that the way that we solve the problem of Serbia and the Western Balkans, and this sort of sense that it sits on the outside and it's sulky in the corner while all the rest are heading towards the EU and NATO, is by solving Kosovo. We get rid of that issue, and I think that we start to see Serbia moving in a more pro-Western direction. Or that's certainly what I thought until the start of the war in Ukraine. And then I think the problem we've seen is that people have latched onto this, that even though they should really see themselves as much more like the Ukrainians, feeling they've lost territory and everything, and I know the West will certainly not want to encourage that view, that in fact what they've instead gone and seen is that, it's Russia that's giving the West a bloody nose, and we're happy about that because that's what the West did to us. So I think you're dealing with a very, very complex psychology that, in Serbia on this. I've tried to be balanced in how I see things and Russian influence, and when I don't feel it's as strong as people like to make out in the West, I'm happy to say that. But I have been worried over the past couple of years that, to use the colloquialism, they've been drinking the Russian Kool-Aid.
Yeah, an American product in the context of a Russian analogy. I think it's we've had many different other creator on the channel actually about Russia at this point, and I think that there is I don't know if you would want to call it a Russian destabilisation. That's their grand strategy now, but it does seem that they benefit from just disruptive measures, not enough to ultimately change the direction of something, but enough that it prevents said area or country or whatever it is from being realized. I know that I said a lot there and conveyed very little. What I mean is that in the case of Ukraine, Bosnia, or whoever, if they can create enough destabilization, even an internal violence, conflict, it prevents the countries from becoming part of NATO and so on as part of it. So
precisely, exactly. The frozen conflicts, for all sorts of reasons, have been serving Moscow for a very, very long time. That if it can't directly influence the situation, then, or exert leverage over a government, use those frozen conflicts to its best advantage. And it doesn't want them solved. The last thing it wants is these things solved. And so we've seen these different situations, and it has been a real problem. And of course, now we're in a very, very different world where we have to consider, how that affects efforts to try and solve these.
No, 100%. And I think that the events in Africa are, by extension, an example of Russia doesn't have the same capacity to leverage its influence in the way the US or even China does. So what it does is very effectively leverage certain entry points, I think, the coups in Sahel or Nicaragua or Cuba, Venezuela, countries that have a long-standing relationship with the country, and thereby it still gives Russia a leverage, a footing in said region to be an influence, to be a disruptor, but still not enough of a hegemonic power like, say, America in its backyard of Latin America or something. So Russia, Balkans, it's near abroad, it's able to much more do it than, say, United States is, given the proximity and so on. But James, thank you so much again for this fantastic dive. Really, really fascinating. Want to have you back for Cyprus. Want to have you back again. I don't know. Hopefully there isn't a flare-up in Kosovo that warrants an episode, but inevitably there will be in this wonderful part of the world. Balkans really is somewhere that I don't think enough people appreciate just how wonderful it is, and they must go. I'm talking to you, American audience, and I look forward to seeing you all in part 3, where we go into a bit more of James's thematical expertise, particularly destabilisation and state successions. So look forward to that. But till then, next time, everyone, take care.